there is a chair, and the chair is killing everyone who sits in it. In Game of Thrones, they call it the Iron Throne, a twisted heap of 1,000 swords, so sharp that a careless king can cut himself just sitting down. And that's the point of it. The throne is supposed to hurt. Everyone in the story wants it. Almost everyone who gets it dies for it. Two great families tear the entire realm apart, reaching for it. One from the cold north, honorable and doomed, and one golden, rich, and ruthless, who will do absolutely anything to hold the crown. You know them as the Starks and the Lannisters. And here is the thing George R.R. Martin has said, flatly, in interview after interview. He did not invent them. He took them, bloodline, color, and catastrophe, from a real war. A war between two real families whose names he barely even bothered to disguise. The Starks are the House of York. The Lannisters are the House of Lancaster. Stark York, Lannister Lancaster. He kept the initials. And the crown they fought over really did work like the Iron Throne. For 30 years in real England, the most powerful men in the country killed each other to sit on it. And one after another, the men who won it were dead inside a few years, some inside a few months. Fathers, sons, brothers, boys. The throne took all of them. This is real roots, the real history behind the stories you love. And today, the true story Martin ripped the Starks and the Lannisters straight out of. A 30-year bloodbath called the Wars of the Roses. It has a mad king. It has a scheming queen. It has the most powerful backroom manipulator in English history. It has two princes who vanish into a tower and are never seen alive again. And it ends the way you least expect. Let's start with the crack that opened it all. Let's start with a king who could not rule. His name was Henry VI, and he was, by every honest account, the least suitable king England ever crowned. He became king as a baby, 9 months old, which is already a problem, because a baby cannot govern, and other men have to do it for him. But that was survivable. Plenty of kings started as children. The unsurvivable part came later. Henry grew up gentle, pious, hopeless with money, and utterly uninterested in the one thing a medieval king absolutely had to be good at: war. And then in 1453, he simply stopped. He fell into some kind of complete mental collapse. For over a year, he was unresponsive. He couldn't speak, couldn't recognize people, couldn't hold up his own head. When his baby son was brought to him and presented as his heir, he gave no sign that he saw the child at all. If you're watching Game of Thrones in your head right now, you already know this man. A king on the throne who cannot actually rule, while stronger, colder people gather at the edges of the room, doing sums. A crown sitting on a head that can't hold its weight. And everyone in the hall quietly working out what happens when it falls. Because here's the iron law of both the show and the real history. A weak king is not a peaceful king. A weak king is the most dangerous thing a kingdom can have. When the person on the throne can't hold power, everyone near it starts reaching. And the reaching is what kills people. So who reached? On one side, standing closest to the crown, was the House of Lancaster, the king's own family, the reigning house. Think Lannister, the family in power, the family that intends to stay in power, whatever it costs. And their real strength wasn't the broken king at all. It was his wife, Margaret of Anjou. If you have ever watched Cersei Lannister sit beside a king who cannot protect her son and thought, that woman is the only truly dangerous person in the room, then you have already met Margaret of Anjou, because Cersei is largely built out of her. Margaret was French, she was clever, she was ferociously protective of her young son's right to the throne, and when her husband collapsed into silence, she did not weep in a corner. She moved to take control of the kingdom herself, a queen ruling in all but name, in a century that despised the very idea of a woman doing it. Martin has pointed straight at her. Cersei fighting like a lioness for her children, against a whole world that wants to push her aside. That is Margaret, almost undisguised. On the other side stood the House of York. Think Stark. Powerful, respected, with a genuinely strong claim, and, at least at the start, a sense that they were the ones in the right. Their leader was Richard, Duke of York. He was, by blood, arguably a better candidate for the throne than the broken Henry himself. He was competent where Henry was helpless. And as the king sat silent and the queen seized the reins, Richard of York looked at the collapsing kingdom and thought what every doomed Stark in Martin's story thinks. Someone has to set this right. I have the claim. I have the duty. I should be the one. That instinct, the honorable man who steps forward because the realm needs saving, is exactly what gets Starks killed. And it is exactly what happened to Richard of York. Because reaching for a crown, however good your reasons, is a declaration of war. And in 1455, it became one. Now, one honest note, because this channel lives on getting it right. The name Wars of the Roses, York's white rose against Lancaster's red, is mostly a later romantic invention. People at the time didn't call it that, and the neat rose symbolism was tidied up centuries afterward, partly by Shakespeare, partly by Sir Walter Scott. The families were real, the claims were real, the war was extremely real. The pretty flowers are the part that got dressed up in hindsight, which, if you've been paying attention, is exactly what happened to the head on the platter in our last video. Real history goes in dry. Stories make it beautiful on the way out. So the war begins, and now watch how the throne starts collecting its victims, because this is where the real story out Game of Thrones is Game of Thrones. Richard of York fights for years to control the king, to be named heir, to secure the throne. And in December 1460, at a battle called Wakefield, he loses. Richard of York is killed, and Margaret of Anjou, the Cersei of this story, does something to his corpse that Martin fans will recognize in their bones. She has his severed head mounted on the gates of the city of York, and on that head she has them place a paper crown, a mocking crown. You wanted to be king? Here is your crown. Wear it on the wall. Sit with that, because it is real, it is in the chronicles, and it is more savage than most of what makes it onto television. The head of the great Stark figure of this war, crowned in paper, staring down from the walls of the city that shared his name. Killing. The head of House York did not end House York. It just handed the claim to his son. A young man, taller and harder, and better at war than his father ever was. And within 3 months, that son marched an army to London and had himself crowned King Edward IV. The dead man's boy took the throne his father died reaching for. The North remembers, so does the son. Edward was good at this. Genuinely good. A brilliant battlefield commander who won crushing victories, drove Margaret and her Lancastrians out, and locked the broken old King Henry in the Tower of London. For a moment, it looked finished. York had won. The throne had chosen. Except we are not even halfway, and the throne is not remotely finished with its work. Because now we meet the single most Game of Thrones human being in this entire true story. A man who is Littlefinger and Varys and every whispering schemer in that show rolled into one. His name was the Earl of Warwick, and history gave him a nickname that tells you everything. The Kingmaker. Warwick was the richest, most powerful noble in England who wasn't a king, and he had figured out something subtle and deadly. He didn't need to sit on the throne himself. He needed to be the man who put people on it. He had helped make Edward king. He fully expected to run the kingdom from just behind the young man's shoulder, the real power, the hand behind the crown. You have watched this exact character, the one who says out loud that he doesn't want the throne. He just wants to decide who sits on it. The one who trades daughters and alliances like cards. Warwick is Peter Baelish with an army. Chaos isn't a pit, it's a ladder. And Warwick spent his whole life climbing other men's claims. And then his puppet king stopped being a puppet. Edward grew up, started making his own decisions, and worst of all, married a woman Warwick hadn't chosen, wrecking a French alliance the Kingmaker had been carefully building. Warwick was humiliated. The man who made kings had been ignored by the king he made. So Warwick did the most audacious thing in the whole war. He switched sides. The man who had destroyed the Lancastrians to put York on the throne now turned around, allied with Margaret of Anjou, his old mortal enemy, pulled the broken old King Henry back out of the tower, and put the crown back on that confused, gentle head. For a few months in 1470, the Kingmaker had unmade a king and remade the one he'd overthrown. He had personally, wearing no crown himself, controlled who ruled England twice. That is the fantasy of the backroom schemer taken to its absolute historical limit. And like every schemer in Martin's world, it ended exactly one way. Edward came back. The two armies met in a thick spring fog at a place called Barnet in 1471, and in the confusion and the murk, the Kingmaker was pulled down and killed. The man who made kings died in the mud, on foot, having run out of other people's crowns to wear. And weeks later, the last Lancastrian hope, Margaret's son, the boy the whole war had been fought to crown, was killed too. And the broken old King Henry, back in the Tower, quietly died the same night. Nobody believes it was natural. Edward had simply run out of reasons to keep him alive. So now, truly, York has won. Every rival is dead. Edward IV rules, secure, victorious with two young sons to follow him. Because Edward, strong, brilliant, unbeatable Edward, dies. Not in battle, just dies, suddenly, in his bed, in 1483, still a young man. And he leaves the crown to his son, a 12-year-old boy, Edward V, a child king. Again, we have come all the way around the circle, and you already know from both the history and the story that a child on the throne is not an heir. He's a problem. And there is a grown man standing right next to him, doing the sum. That man is the boy's own uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the dead king's brother, trusted to protect the child and see him safely crowned. Instead, Richard took the boy, and the boy's younger brother. He placed both princes in the Tower of London. For their protection, he said. He had them declared illegitimate, brushing aside their claim, and he took the crown himself as King Richard III. And the two boys, the rightful child king and his little brother, were seen playing in the Tower gardens through that summer. And then less often. And then, not at all. They were never seen again. Nobody knows for certain what happened to the princes in the Tower. It is the most famous cold case in English history. But the overwhelming likelihood, then and now, is that Richard had the children killed to secure a throne that was never his. Two boys erased so that a crown could change heads. If your stomach turned at the fate of children in Game of Thrones, and Martin has never been shy about that being where his story goes, understand that he did not have to invent it. It was sitting right here, in 1483, in a real tower, with two real little boys, who went in and did not come out. Richard III had the throne now. He had done the unthinkable to get it. He kept it for 2 years, because here at last is the ending. And it is the most Game of Thrones twist in the entire true story. Because after 30 years of Yorks and Lancastrians butchering each other for the crown, after fathers and sons and brothers and children fed one by one into that throne, the man who finally ended it and took everything was almost nobody. His name was Henry Tudor. And his claim to the throne was frankly terrible. A thin thread of royal blood through an illegitimate line. A man who had spent most of his life in exile in France, watching the great houses destroy each other from a safe distance across the water. He was the last remnant of the Lancastrian cause precisely because almost everyone with a better claim was already dead. The war had killed all the obvious kings. What was left, at the bottom of the barrel, was an exile nobody had feared. And in 1485, Henry Tudor landed with a small army, met Richard III at a field called Bosworth, and won. Richard, the last York king, was killed in the fighting, the last English king ever to die in battle. His body was stripped, thrown over a horse, and eventually lost so completely that it turned up 500 years later under a car park in the city of Leicester in 2012. The last man to be killed for that throne, found beneath a painted parking space, with the wounds of Bosworth still on his skull. And Henry Tudor, the outsider, the long shot, the man from across the sea with the weak claim and the patient plan, took the crown. Then he married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of the House of York, and joined the two warring families into one. The red rose and the white finally fused, and the throne, at last, stopped killing people, because an outsider nobody took seriously had walked in from the margins and taken the whole board. Now tell me that isn't the shape of the story you know, because that is the deepest thing Martin took from the Wars of the Roses. Not just the names, not just Cersei out of Margaret, or Littlefinger out of Warwick, or the murdered children in the tower. He took the lesson of it. That the throne is a machine for destroying the people who want it most. That honor gets you killed, and cunning gets you killed, and the crown outlasts all of them. And that when two great, proud, powerful families throw everything they have into the fire, fighting each other, the person who finally walks away with it all is very often the one watching quietly from the edge, whom nobody bothered to fear. 30 years, 2 houses, a dozen kings and would-be kings, and a chair that took nearly every one of them. Martin didn't need to build the Iron Throne. England forged it first, out of real crowns and real bodies, and left it sitting in the history books for anyone brave enough to reach in and pull it out. This has been Real Roots, the real history behind the stories you love. Next time, the most famous sword in fantasy, pulled from a stone by a boy who would be king, and the real warlord buried in a real grave that people spent 1,000 years insisting would rise again. King Arthur.